evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Gavriel Rosenfeld, the president here at the Center for Jewish History, and I'd like to welcome you all formally to this evening's event. Tonight, we're going to be doing three things. So first and foremost, of course, we're formally opening our new exhibit, Between Antisemitism and Activism, the Jewish University Experience in Historical Perspective. I saw already lots of you looking at the small vignettes from different eras of Jewish history, so I'm grateful for your interest. Obviously, we are having an in-depth panel discussion this evening with a group of noted panelists who will be expanding upon the themes addressed in the exhibit. And of course, on a more sober note, the third thing we're doing is marking the one-year anniversary of the October 7th terror attacks by Hamas and the ensuing turmoil that has affected Jews around the world, especially on college campuses here in the US. So, the history of the Jewish university experience is vast. It's as vast as it is timely. And it goes without saying that our exhibit does not try and venture any sweeping claims, any comprehensive claims about this important topic. Rather, it examines 5 different capsule moments in Jewish history from the 1930s to the present, moments when Jewish students and faculty faced both adversity and opportunity. And although anti-Semitism, of course, does stand at the center of this exhibit, we wanted to make clear that it's only part of the story, and that Jews have not only been the passive victims of persecution, but have asserted themselves as campus activists on any number of fronts. And I hope that you'll be able to see the two sides of that coin in the exhibit. Tonight's discussion, of course, will enable us to expand and reflect further on these points. And to help us in this endeavor, I'd like to introduce our 4 panelists. For lack of any original way of doing so, in alphabetical order. Eric Alterman is Distinguished Professor of English and Journalism at Brooklyn College. He received his PhD in history from Stanford University and was a longtime columnist for The Nation, in addition to being the author of at least a dozen books, including the 2022 volume We Are Not One, A History of America's Fight Over Israel. Rebecca Coburn is the Russell and Bettina Knapp Associate Professor of American Jewish History at Columbia University, and is also the author of numerous books, including the forthcoming study, A Credit to the Nation, East European Immigrant Bankers and American Finance, 1870 to 1930, which will be appearing with Harvard University Press next year. She directs Columbia's Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies and is a member of the Columbia Anti-Semitism Task Force. Jody Redorn, here on the end, is editor-in-chief at The Forward, a position that she assumed in the year 2019 after more than 2 decades at the New York Times, including a stint as Jerusalem bureau chief. And since October 7th, she has been making frequent appearances on such networks as CNN, MSNBC, The Brian Lehrer Show, on WNYC, among many, many others. And then finally, Daniel Schwartz, to my left, is Professor of History at George Washington University and the author of numerous books, including Ghetto, The History of a Word, which appeared in 2019. And perhaps most importantly, he is the new chair of our Academic Advisory Council here at the Center for Jewish History. Now, before we proceed, I'd like to thank some of the people who were instrumental in making both the exhibit and tonight's discussion possible. On our board of directors, Ron Lieberman, proposed the original idea after returning from an important visit to Vienna. And our board chair, Peter Baldwin, provided additional encouragement as we worked to realize this idea's potential on what I have to confess was a very tight schedule, but we wanted it up and complete before the fall semester. And so the timeliness was of the essence, and I'm really grateful to everybody who made it possible. I'd also like to thank the David Berg Foundation for its crucial support, and Michelle Tachi especially for her steadfast commitment to the Center for Jewish History's public history mission. All the key members of the exhibition team are duly noted in the credits at the exhibition's conclusion, but I do want to highlight the efforts of Miriam Mora, who helped in the curating of the exhibit, and Shana Marchese for her curatorial and design contributions. And of course, to all the center staff who are not only helping to make tonight's event possible, but who do such an outstanding job during the calendar year. Finally, all of you here in the audience, I'd like to thank you as well. You've been active supporters of the center for years. I hope you'll remain active supporters in the coming year, 2025, when we celebrate our 25th anniversary. And having duly thanked everybody, I hope, I want to just say one quick thing about tonight's format, which is as follows. We're going to have 3 rounds of questions for the panelists in roughly 15-minute segments. We'll then, of course, follow that up with audience Q&A. We want to have a vigorous discussion. There will be note cards. I think you already have those collected at the front, and then there'll be some CJH staff people who will collect those about 20 minutes, 25 minutes before we need to start our Q&A session. So with that, I'm going to take my seat. We're going to start off with our conversation, and I hope you have your thinking caps on. All right, so to frame tonight's discussion, it goes without saying that there's been a fierce debate in the United States about how serious a problem anti-Semitism is on college campuses. Some argue that it's omnipresent. Others argue, by contrast, that it's marginal. To extrapolate further on that, some people would like to claim that we're back in the 1930s, essentially. Others have more controversially argued that the current situation amounts to a moral panic. So without being too binary about it, and there's always room for some place in between, I'd like to start off our question and answer session here by asking our panelists to weigh in on which historical precedents relating to the Jewish university experience they believe help us to make sense of the present moment, at least from their own disciplinary perspective. So Dan, if I can begin with you, when you think about the present moment and you think about historical moments from the past, what comes to mind?
Vote? Okay. Thank you. So I was thinking 16 years ago, roughly, the day after the 2008 presidential election, I was teaching my modern Jewish history survey class. And you might remember that the night of the election, after it was called for Obama, there were many students who were celebrating outside the White House gates until late into the wee hours of the morning. And so I saw that many of my students were bleary-eyed and tired, but we were focusing on that day on the rise of the anti-Semitic movement in the late 19th century, focusing on Germany and Austria. And I kind of ribbed them saying, you know, something like, lest you think students have always been as left-leaning as you, today we're going to see that in many ways one of the hubs of the anti-Semitic movement when it emerged in Germany and Austria and elsewhere in Europe was in fact the university. And so one of the things we talked about that day were these kind of like student fraternities, fraternal associations in Germany and Austria that were known as Burschenschaften. And these tended to be, I mean, they had kind of emerged in the early 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars and after, you know, Napoleon had been rolled back. And in many ways at the time, they were advocating a kind of German nationalism, a vision of a unified German nation state, which was not a conservative position at the time because most conservatives wanted to keep things you know, in terms of like different German states and principalities, and this vision of a greater Germany certainly didn't find favor in the eyes of the Habsburg Emperor and famous kind of chief of staff Metternich. So, but there was a kind of a difference of vision of whether this vision of a kind of unified German nation, would it be kind of somewhat of a liberal vision that would be inclusive, or would it be more based on a kind of like fundamentally folkish Christian Germanic character? And so this goes back and forth over the course of the 19th century, but with the emergence of the anti-Semitic movement in the late 1870s and the 1880s, these fraternities take a hard right turn and very much toward an embrace of anti-Semitism. And because we don't have much time, I'll just focus on Vienna in particular. You know, Vienna in the late 19th century is in many ways a city of tremendous contradictions. On the one hand, it is, you know, emerging as a kind of cradle of artistic and cultural modernism. It is the city of Sigmund Freud, of Arthur Schnitzler, of yeah, who else? Arnold Schoenberg and other luminaries, Gustav Mahler. But it also has a reputation by the fin de siècle of being perhaps the most anti-Semitic city in all of Europe. Situation at the University of Vienna in particular kind of bore out these tensions. Because as was the case in many parts of Central Europe, but in many ways in Vienna, perhaps most pointedly, Jews who had only really been able to kind of become an official community in Vienna after the revolutions of 1848, this community had grown tremendously, and by the late 19th century, they represent some 10% of the city, but they are what sociologists might call highly overrepresented. And I mean that not as a kind of normative claim, like there's too many Jews here, but just based on the kind of percentage of Jews in the city vis-a-vis their reputation, both among this kind of educated middle class, what Germans refer to as like the Bildungsbürgertum, but also, and in many ways, among some of the creators, artists, innovators, producers, saloniers in the city. But in terms of education as well, at the University of Vienna, by the late 19th century, you have Jews accounting for, almost like 50% of the total number of law students at the University of Vienna. Medical students, I'm sorry. Medical is always more important. You want to be a doctor before you're a lawyer. And also even in law, like something like almost a quarter of the students. So you have this kind of overrepresentation. And in many ways, the anti-Semitism is part of a kind of backlash. And so what you see is many of these fraternities, some of which had formerly accepted Jews, these Burschenschaften, now turn extremely anti-Semitic, bar Jews from being admitted, and sometimes so there's one very famous case of another notable Jew in late 19th century Vienna, Theodor Herzl, who begins studying law at the University of Vienna in 1878. And he is accepted into one of these Burschenschaften, namely the one that was known as Albia. But after the beginnings of this movement, really begins in earnest in 1879, 1880, but he is very offended by the fact that these movements, these fraternities have turned so anti-Jewish, and so he decides that he is going to kind of resign his membership. And I think maybe he was a little bit hoping that they would say, "Oh, please come back," but in fact, that did not happen. There are interesting things about these fraternities at the time, even though, I don't know how many of you saw Leopoldstadt, for example, Tom Stoppart's play when it was here on Broadway a few years ago. But something that was very big in terms of these fraternal associations, there was a whole culture of dueling. Even as kind of people, many ways, countries, populations were beginning to move away from this. But in the late 19th century in Germany and Austria, it's kind of like they're kind of really leaning into it in earnest. But the whole idea of dueling was this kind of cult of honor, this idea that a man who truly cares about his honor, and there's very much a masculine ideal here, will never allow himself to be insulted or offended without kind of taking up swords to defend his honor. Okay, but the crucial thing is that often, because this was seen in many ways as an elite and aristocratic ideal, Jews were not to be given the satisfaction of dueling if they felt offended by a non-Jew, Gentile, perhaps in one of these fraternities. And so, Herzl really was almost obsessed with dueling. Writes about it constantly in his diaries, has visions of him winning some huge duel to end all duels. Even one of his plays, The New Ghetto, which he writes in 1894, culminates in this famous dueling scene where this kind of young Jewish wannabe in Vienna ends up dying because he wanted to prove his honor, and he's saying to him, I can't get out of the ghetto.
So
anyway.
Dan, if we
Yeah, so I'm going to reduce it. So in any way, so I was just going to say, obviously it's very different because in many ways this was coming more from the right than the left, but you still see here, I think, certain similar ideas. I mean, and also I would say there's a kind of racializing of Jewishness that we don't see to the same extent. But what we do see is certainly the same idea of kind of Jews are becoming too powerful in society. They control too many, of the kind of power centers. They control the media. They control the banks. And a lot of these ideas, we still see kind of in the latest round, shall we say.
Good. So if we switch from the European context to the American context, Rebecca, what do we see from your perspective in terms of relevant historical precedents?
Okay, so first of all, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm taking everyone back in time, but back to New York. And what I'm going to talk about is how the history, Jewish history, the history of Columbia, and New York City history all overlap. And history in many ways helps us orient for the present. So all the research I have done since October 7th, because the donor of my chair asked me a question about, is this the first time that Jews and politics have shaken Columbia? And the answer is no. So I'm going not back to 68, which everyone always thinks. I'm going back to 1917, when the first student, Leon Sampson, is expelled for political reasons because he is the head of the Anti-Militaristic Society of Columbia and CCNY and the head of the Intercollegiate Pacifist Society. He speaks out during the summer. He speaks at a event with Emma Goldman against World War I and is expelled immediately by the Board of Trustees. He sues. There are 2 other students who are expelled for passing around a petition against the draft. Morris Hillquit, the head of the Socialist Party of America, defends those 2 students and gets them off. They're indicted. But what's really important to be thinking about is in this time, when you say socialist, there's only one group you're talking about. And you see popping up in Columbia's minutes of the Board of Trustees that they don't want to become known as the school of the socialists. So what ends up happening, right, after Leon Sampson is expelled and sued and the judge actually upholds his expulsion, is Columbia starts something that has now become the norm in higher education, a quota, a regional quota, and a quota for Jews. But particularly why this is important for the history of Columbia is people don't realize until the end of the 1970s, Columbia did not have enough dorms for its students. It had to take students who would commute from New York City. Who is the group who has transformed New York City at the turn of the 20th century? Jews. Most importantly, they are over 35% of the graduates of high schools. And they are the ones who are disproportionately applying to Columbia. And the Board of Trustees talks about what we should do, right? How can we have one group? Oh, and I should just say, admittance to Columbia is only based on a test. Everyone, it's a test in the classics, right? And the whole process of application to Columbia is transformed in the 1920s in response to understanding, when Leon Sampson is expelled, he does cause a few riots. He talks on campus, he talks off campus. He wants to ignite a socialist response to World War I. So in response to that, Columbia keeps trying to limit the number of Jews on campus. They require then an application where you actually fill out your address and your parents' occupation. There is an interview that's instituted, and most famously, in the 1930s, 1928 exactly, they create Seth Low Junior College, which is a college in Brooklyn. For those, it's seen as part of its professional studies, but it is known as the College for Jews. All right, and Isaac Asimov actually openly says how humiliated he is. So if you don't get into Columbia College, you're sometimes sent to Seth Low Jewish College. So I'm gonna stop here, but I just wanna say that many of the structures that we now accept as part of college applications the birth of it is in this moment after a socialist student who, I should just say, Leon Sampson only immigrates to America in 1914. and he's already expelled in 1917, right? But I want to just say it's clear that he's very smart because he's obviously fluent in English, right? So it is, that all sets in motion just not only shaping Columbia, but really higher education writ large. And
thank you. Eric, if we've touched a little bit about, touched a little on the 19th century and the early 20th century, what historical era would you like to say a little bit about for making sense of today?
Thank you. First of all, I want to
Mike.
thank everybody for coming. I want to thank, am I on?
Yep.
I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to thank the New York Mets for winning the first game of the doubleheader, so we didn't have to watch the second game, and therefore we could all be here. Obviously, it wasn't just Columbia that had a quota for Jews. It was all elite institutions because they were worried about being overrun by Jews. I once, when I was a graduate student at Yale, I wrote a piece about Yale and its getting rid of its quota. And funnily enough, one of the people who was most responsible for pressuring the president of Yale at the time, Kingman Brewster, he was a very Protestant fellow, but the person who was on his case was Eugene Victor Rostow, who together with his brother Walt Whitman Rostow, the Rostow parents were socialists and they named their kids after Eugene Debs and Walt Whitman. And then the Rostow brothers went on to think up and had a lot to do with Vietnam War. And then, but in letting Jews into Yale, they undermined their own politics, because what happened is in the era of 1960, the late 1960s protests, it was remarkably dominated by Jews. So just a few years after Jews were not allowed into elite colleges, they overwhelmed the admissions offices, and I have a few, I could spend my entire talk just reading these statistics to you of to what degree Jews dominated the protests of the 1960s. I'll read a few and then I'll make a couple of remarks. In the first half of the 1960s, Jews made up 5% of the population of the United States, of the college students of the United States. Yet between 30 and 50% of Students for a Democratic Society, 60% of the leadership, 6 out of the 11 Sterling Committee members of the free speech movement at Berkeley, 1/3 of the weathermen arrested by police, 50% of the membership of California's Peace and Freedom Policy, 2/3 of the white freedom riders who went south, 45% of those who protested student grades to draft boards at the University of Chicago, University of Michigan, 23% of Jewish college students identified themselves as far left, compared to, say, 4% of Protestants. And a large, I could go on, but just make this larger point. A large study of student radicalism conducted by the American Council of Education in the late 1960s found that a Jewish background was the single most important predictor of participation in protest activities. So Jews, people talk about the 1960s and the 1970s as the golden age of American Jewish achievement. And you can see that in both the admittance to these elite institutions of these third and fourth generation of Jews, and then their rebellion against what they were being told to do. There's one wonderful quote that I keep writing about in the New York Times Magazine. When I hate to admit this to such a large group. I grew up in Scarsdale, and there, when I first moved to Scarsdale, when my parents first moved to Scarsdale in 1964, there was an entry in a Yiddish how-to book, and it defined, I don't know, my parents used to speak Yiddish, so I wouldn't understand them, so I don't know the word, but the word out of place meant a Jew in Scarsdale. And then later on, when I was growing up in Scarsdale, the joke was, why is Scarsdale known for its gardening? Because there's a rose in bloom on every block. So it became Jewish in this period between 1964 and later on. And then there was this quote of a young woman in the New York Times Magazine who was one of the college protesters, and she said, "You don't know the meaning of the word hell. if you haven't grown up in Scarsdale, New York. And this quote became famous because neoconservative Jews were furious about it. And that everybody should want to live in Scarsdale. That's the American dream. And these Jews who had struggled, their parents had struggled, to give them this college education at these elite institutions, were then rebelling against it and saying, it sucks, America sucks. We want something different, although they had a hard time defining what was different. I bring this up because a significant portion of the people protesting in Gaza are Jewish. The ADL codes every single pro-Palestinian protest on campus as anti-Semitic. So I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know if anyone's seen any research on this. Rebecca, maybe you know, or one of you know, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's close to 30, 40% of the kids in the encampments are themselves Jewish, protesting against Israel. And this is, what I'm saying is a consistent pattern among Jewish college students. What's interesting now, something I wrote about in the wonderful book that I wrote that Gav mentioned, is that this wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. There's been a real cleavage between the support for the state of Israel and American Jews that you can see in young people far more than anyone else. Young people are now more pro-Palestinian than they are pro-Israel, and certainly elite college students are more pro-Palestinian than more Israel. And so it shouldn't surprise us that this group of students who have historically led protests are now protesting Israel because American Jews feel themselves, young American Jews, feel themselves alienated by the actions of the state of Israel, whether you like it or not, it's true. And so the shock of so many Jews, young Jews, protesting the state of Israel should not be a shock. The people who should wise up are the people who are accusing all of those protesters of being anti-Semitic. Some of them are, but it's crazy to accuse this enormous group of Jews of being anti-Semitic, in my view.
Thank you, Eric. So Jody, as the one non-historian, but somebody who's engaged in covering all these turbulent events from the perspective of the legendary Forward, how would you say that you've taken a historical perspective in either your perspective on what's been going on in the last months or what the Forward's own perspective has been in terms of news coverage?
Yeah, thanks for including me in this history class. I did major in history at Yale as an undergraduate, and actually my senior essay was about protest. It was about a little-known campaign that led up to the Freedom Summer movement, and so, and it did involve a lot of white Jews, including Joe Lieberman. But anyway, I think, and we also, of course, think about journalism as the first draft of history. When I was talking to some colleagues to remind myself of what pieces we had published relating to the campus protests did draw on history, one of my editors suggested that I talk about the piece we did at the end of October last year when we sent a bunch of people to campuses to write about what it was like on campus. And I was like, I think we mean, more historical than that. So we were not, so anyway, and we did. There are a few pieces I want to draw out. Three in particular. One we published in, I think, December, which was a deep look at the historical roots of Students for Justice in Palestine. It was by my colleague Arno Rosenfeld, and he went back and did a bunch of research looking at the way it was founded in Berkeley and looking at a lot of local paper and campus paper coverage of the earliest demonstration staged by SJP, and then he also tracked down the guy who founded it, who now works at a bookstore in Jordan, and talked to him about those early days. And one of the surprising things, which I definitely didn't know, and I think most of our readers didn't know, is that SJP was actually a sort of moderate response to a Muslim protest movement against Israel that was far to the left and more anti-Semitic and very anti-Zionist. And SJP was a moderating force at Berkeley at the time, and so Arno traced its history from those roots through to the present day. The second piece I want to mention is a piece that one of our reporters, Andrew Silverstein, did, going back to Tufts University in around 1990, where there was a columnist for one of the student newspapers who wrote very powerfully about the importance of free speech on campus, even to advocate for allowing a speaker who was a leader of the Nation of Islam and whose talk was very objectively anti-Semitic, but this young, tough student was advocating that there was controversy over whether this man should be allowed to speak or not, and this tough student was advocating that yes, he should, and his name is Jonathan Greenblatt, and he is now CEO of the ADL, and as many people know, he has been actively outspoken about the need to restrict protests on campus and discourse on campus now in this era. And we asked him about it, and he talked about the ways in which he would say the same things now versus what he said then, and the ways in which the world had changed, and that he thought that the campuses needed to protect students in different ways from dangerous speech. And the third, I know I'm running out of time, but the third is an op-ed that we published this spring, right as the encampments were really flourishing, by a man named Nicholas Freudenberg, who had been arrested in the Columbia protests of 1968 and had also been expelled from Columbia after that. And he wrote I want to just read a couple of excerpts from his piece, because he basically tried to write a piece that said, if I'd known then what I know now, like what would I tell the protesters of today? So he said, on the one hand, talking to the protesters of today, their courage, conviction, and determination to stop another war fills me with hope for our country's future. On the other hand, the movements I have participated in also triggered backlashes. They aroused those who opposed the changes we sought and set off new waves of repression. I worry that today's movement could follow a similar trajectory, a profoundly alarming consequence in this election year. And he also talked about the importance of, he says, perhaps the most important next step for today's activists is both to articulate with moral clarity what they are against, while also presenting a clear vision of a future better than today's world. At Columbia in 1968, before we occupied buildings, we spent months hosting discussions in dormitories, debating professors and students in the classroom, and teaching each other about the history of the wars in Southeast Asia and U.S. foreign policy. We learned that talking to those who disagreed with us helped us understand their concerns, refine our arguments, and win over some of their hearts and minds. That, to me, is what really sums up the way things are tragically so different on campus today, both within the protest movement and I think in the classroom and the dormitories. I think we do not see this kind of discussion either teaching each other about the history of the place. We see all kinds of ahistorical claims that are based on paradigms from other movements and not based on the history of the Middle East. And we also do not, this idea, we learned that talking to those who disagreed with us helped us understand their concerns. I mean, I do not find many examples of that going on today.
Thank you. So for round two, we're going to ask all of our panelists to talk about their own personal experiences on college campuses. After all, we have Columbia, George Washington, and Brooklyn College represented. Rebecca, if I could ask you to begin. We've had some conversations about misconceptions about the student protesters. You've been involved in, on a daily basis with what's been going on over the last 11 months. Can you tell us a little bit about your perspective on what's been going on at Columbia from your own personal vantage point?
So first of all, I want to thank the journalists for the first draft, but I want to use this opportunity to start correcting the first draft, because what I found fascinating is Columbia's campus was on lockdown, and I would read things in the newspaper, and I'm like, what are they talking about? So I want to just make one thing crystal clear, and I hope everyone leaves with this, of how crucial gender is. So the encampment was 75% women, okay? And those arrested, the first group arrested, the 91, 58 were Barnard students, and of the 33 Columbia, only 10 were men, all right? So, and the second encampment we can talk about, but I want us just to be thinking.
Rebecca, doesn't that reflect, sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah.
but I mean, that reflects the reality of like everything at college campuses these days, right? Like much student activism, student leadership, many colleges are nearing 60% women undergraduates. I mean, like this is a shift that's happened in the last.
I mean, I think it's something that I hope in the future historians will analyze, because the analogy to 68, which was predominantly male, let's just say above 95%, the way in which the encampment, and I'm now going to just say, I want us to move beyond binaries of the encampment is this, it's, unsafe, say, it would change throughout the day. I went by the encampment every day, but I went into it twice, and once was at night, and I have to say at night, it was a totally different place, which I understand why the undergraduates were afraid. So I'm just saying that I want us to move beyond these binaries, that it was peaceful, it was violent, it was this. It was never one thing. It was many things, and it changed throughout the day, and it changed over the course of it being there. So the first one, which only lasted a day, was very different from the one that lasted much longer, and there was this interaction with New York City. So people from the outside, this notion that there was in the campus and out the campus, they would interact with each other. So I just want to leave that, all the university presidents who were summoned to Congress were women. The ones who lose their jobs are women. I just think we have to be thinking through understanding, and I'm now going to say one other thing. The reason the students from October 7th, my job was totally transformed, in that I've always been teaching, and I run the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, which runs lectures, and we bring in postdocs, but hundreds of students came into my office to tell me about their experience, and for counseling, what I would say. And they were very scared because of what they were reading on social media, and how the students were interacting with each other on social media, threatening each other. What Jody was saying, that there was no way to discuss these very complicated, nuanced questions. They were just if you didn't think like me, you got threatened. I shared before, one of my students got, there's internal in Columbia, this thing called side chat. One of my students got, may you be raped to death like your sisters in Israel. All right? So I said I would be very scared if then someone chanted something. It changes the whole way you experience everything. So I think that this is a new historical moment, which we have to think of how social media played in to these protests as opposed to 68, and influenced how people understood when they heard people chanting, because they had, they're scrolling through their phone and they're reading other things. And we have to just put a big composite picture of understanding the student's experience.
So Eric, you teach at Brooklyn College. Brooklyn College and Columbia are very different places, and yet you've had your own share of personal experiences that I would love if you could tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, thanks. So I have 2, maybe 3 careers simultaneously. One, I was a Nation columnist for 25 years, and among other media, and I'm also an academic and a professor at Brooklyn College. So as a columnist, I'm deeply concerned about these issues. So as a columnist, I'm mostly interested in how powerful Jewish interests, mostly donors, billionaire donors frequently, have used the accusation of anti-Semitism to shut down criticism, what I would believe is legitimate criticism of Israel. So for instance, Mark Rowan, who is a big funder at the ADL and a major funder of Jewish organizations, he demanded the firing of the president of the University of Pennsylvania before October 7th because she allowed a Palestinian arts festival to take place on the campus. They had rented the hall, and that was a reason for her to be fired, that she did not shut down the speakers at this conference, which had nothing to do with the university except that they had rented it. And this is just an extreme example of what you've seen gone into hyperdrive since October 7th. Bill Ackman at Harvard, I'm sure you're all familiar with these stories. On the other hand, I teach at a college, and I was for a while, again, a few years ago, one of the more prominent academic opponents of the BDS movement. I think BDS is inconsistent with the idea of a university and freedom of discourse. I also think it's stupid. I mean, it's stupid because for 2 reasons. One is it attempted to shut down the voices of the very people in Israel who actually care about what happens to the Palestinians. And it's stupid because it has no theory of how it could actually work. So I was consistently harassed in private and in public by the Students for Justice in Palestine because of because I don't think BDS is a good idea for Palestinians. And this was very annoying to me. It really messed up my life. More recently, I wrote this great book, which you really should have in the gift shop here, and about the history of the debate over Israel in the United States. And after October 7th, the union at Brooklyn College asked me to give a talk to the students, which are not the Brooklyn College students of yore. They're not Alan Dershowitz. Thank goodness for small favors. They wanted me to explain to the students who were interested why American Jews felt so deeply connected to Israel, because after all, it is a different country. Most American Jews have never visited Israel. Very few speak Hebrew. It's not like Irish or Italian, it's a special kind of distant nationalism. So I said, sure. So as I was giving this talk, as I was about to give the talk, I was introduced, and about 20 or 30 students stood up and read a statement accusing me of participating in genocide. This was like October 9th, maybe October 15th, something like that, very shortly after. I hadn't had a chance to participate in genocide yet. And then before I could say anything, they left the room and with a bullhorn read the names of Gazans, Palestinians who had been killed in Gaza. So we could go on with the program, but it was very difficult. Leaving aside that the poor kids did not get the benefit of my wisdom, it's fundamentally in opposition to the idea of a university to do this. In a university, we listen to ideas that make us uncomfortable. I have this friend who, until recently, ran the JCRC, and she gave me this great phrase, that universities should not be safe spaces, they should be brave spaces, where we engage in ideas, we learn from each other, and maybe we're not convinced, but we're all here doing the same thing, seeking truth. And this is my great objection to both sides. I hate the word both sides. I've spent my whole life fighting against both sides. In America, one side wants health care and one side wants fascism, and therefore both sides disagree. But in this case, it is both sides. Bill Ackman and Mark Rowan want to shut down honest discourse on Israel-Palestine, and so do the SJP. The difference is, it's like the difference between Israel and Palestine. The Jewish funders are very powerful. The SJP, who I hate, who messed up my life for a long time, almost cost me my job at The Nation, they have only one power, and that's the power of disruption. So that's what they're doing. Just like the Palestinians don't really have a military option, but they can cause a lot of trouble for the Israelis. So I kind of sympathize with their situation, but I think they're going about it in a terribly self-destructive way, and I wish they would not do that.
Thank you, Eric. So Dan, at George Washington, you've had your own share of experiences. Do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about the faculty or the inter-faculty situation from your vantage point?
Sure, but I would like to just respond. I mean, in terms of this Palestinian Arts Festival in the fall of 2023 at Penn, before October 7th, yes, there was pressure on them, on the president to cancel it, which I thought was inappropriate. But we should also not pretend that this was just, some, totally innocent celebration of Palestinian art and culture and literature. I mean, they were inviting people like Roger Waters to zoom in, who is, by any definition of anti-Semite, he would certainly qualify. Goes well beyond anti-Zionism.
Roger Waters is crazy, but he's not an anti-Semite. I mean, you're responding to me. I spent all day.
He should have the right to
spent all
perform.
day with Roger Waters, not me personally, but me and hundreds of other people at the Haaretz New Israel Fund conference on Israel-Palestine. An anti-Semite would not do that. He was generally interested in learning at that conference. So I think that speaks to it. I don't agree with him on anything, although, come on, he's the most talented anti-Semite in the world if he's an anti-Semite. Pink Floyd.
I don't know if we
great.
can litigate the Roger Waters matter in the moment, but Dan, if you could continue with George Washington.
Well, in general, I would say, not simply at George Washington, but I think one of the main feelings that I had last year from the get-go was a real deep disappointment with my colleagues, whether they be colleagues in Jewish studies or colleagues at GW. I mean, just on October 9th, the main learned society in Jewish studies, the Association for Jewish Studies, issued a response to October 7th. Now, they didn't have to do it, but if you were going to do it, basically it was a kind of very thin, gruely, it called out basically, we are sorry for the loss of life that this horrific violence caused. As if violence is some agent out there carrying out violence as opposed to actually Hamas terrorists who are carrying out violence. They were afraid to even mention Hamas. They didn't mention Jews. That I found it's the kind of culture where we're even afraid to call out something as horrific as October 7th. No, that might be, and then I was told, oh, well, we're a learned society. We don't take official positions. So then I went back and found, you took a very strong position on George Floyd, a very strong position on George Floyd in 2020. You took a strong position on Russia, Ukraine. So why not this? Why not this? But then in terms of GW, like many universities late in the semester, there was an encampment formed. And there was a kind of open, because GW in some ways became like the DC hub for all the regional universities happily come to GW and set up camp. There was an open letter that was written kind of defending the encampment to the hilt, which not only kind of drew support from the people that I would have expected, the BDS activists, the anti-racists, somewhat racists, but also just from people that I thought would know better. A letter that was entirely one-sided and, appallingly one-sided, and in some cases just patently false, saying things, these students are acting with a clear moral compass in opposing Israel's genocidal actions against the Palestinians. Even something, they said something, we will not tolerate any weaponization of unfounded assumptions of bigotry to in any way kind of raise questions about what these students are doing. Okay, we can have the debate. I'm sure there are many people there who did not come out of anti-Semitic intent. They may not even known what they were doing there to begin with. But to deny that there was any anti-Semitism in these encampments, literally at GW, had someone showing a sign that said, we'll leave this encampment when the Israelis go back to their true home, Poland. Also like things like, telling the administration, if you act in any way, to interrupt the encampment, you will be on the wrong side of history. Which is first of all, I hate arguments like that, the right side of history, the wrong side of history, as if history is like some judge, kind of like, history is just history. But also, so anybody who has any legitimate objections to some of what's being said and done at these encampments is on the wrong side of history. So, many of my departmental colleagues who, who I thought better, who I expected better of, because, you can say that they're students, college students have always been college students. But if the fact that faculty are egging them on and leading them to believe that their very simplistic view of things is entirely correct, that is in fact an error. So, yeah.
Thank you. I want to make a quick announcement before I turn over to Jody to wrap up the second round. I'd like to make our third round a lightning round, as they say, so we can do 60-second talking points for the future as we're looking forward to it. but I want to make sure to collect the cards and get the audience involved. So Jody, if you can tell us how you've been personally experiencing or covering the college events since
so I
October
don't work in a
7th.
college, but I have been on many college campuses this year, both speaking to groups at UCLA and Yale and Sarah Lawrence, and then also I have twins who are seniors this year. So I've also toured a bunch of colleges and visited them. And after every tour, somebody, usually sometimes wearing a hostage pin, wants to know exactly what it's been like to be Jewish on campus. And so I've talked, and we've sent reporters to all kinds of campuses, first in October and then again in April, May, when the encampments are raging. Also Syracuse, I was there for my niece's graduation. Anyhow, so I feel like all of it's true. You know, like there are encampments where there are earnest activists that probably resemble some of our most romantic memories of demonstrations past. There are encampments that have, there are some number, I think it is a finite number, of really ugly, anti-Semitic, and sometimes even violent, threatening activists. All of that is confined largely to elite campuses that are coastal. There's very little of any of this happening in the middle of the country. And on all of the campuses, even where the encampments were were strongest, there was also a lot of people we would find, Jews, and we mostly focus on talking to Jewish students. We found leaders of groups like JVP in the encampments. We found leaders of pro-Israel groups and Hillel organizations very much either counter-protesting or staying away from the encampments. And we found a lot of students who were trying to study for finals, and also who were extremely frustrated. We published a really beautiful piece by a Columbia student who was very frustrated by the false binaries of this idea that you either had to be in the encampment or counter-protesting the encampment, and who felt that there was not any space for nuance, for discourse, for I think this and that, I care about this and that there was so much being dismissed. I guess for me, probably the most powerful personal moment, I had an experience quite similar to Eric's when I was invited to speak at Sarah Lawrence, I think it was in April. And before in the days leading up to my coming, I can't remember if it was the SJP or the JVP, I think the SJP group, on their Instagram produced this very troubling flyer. They did use my most flattering headshot that I always use, so that was good. But it then showed me with these like bloody hands, and it said I had blood on my hands, and made this very odd reference to a couple of things I had written. And that was like kind of fine. I mean, it's not, whatever. People say lots of nasty things about me and everybody else on the internet. But then I discovered that someone was organizing a counter event. And so similar to what happened to Eric, there was this idea that there was going to be a protest outside my event, before my event, and then all the people who were at the protest were going to go somewhere else to talk amongst themselves. And that I found really not great. And actually wrote to the adjunct professor who was organizing that and invited her to coffee, see whatever, none of that worked. But I was very gratified when I got to the event to find there were 5 students sitting not in the front row, but near the front in keffiyehs and with buttons representing their political points of view. A couple of them asked questions during the event, including a pretty challenging question about something I'd written on October 9th that I don't think I phrased in the way I might have phrased it with more time to think. And afterwards, I spoke. Another one who hadn't asked a question came up to me, and they said, I was going to go to the counter event, and then I decided to come here, and I'm really glad I did. I'm really glad I heard you. So that felt like a tiny victory. I'm still talking about it 6 months later or whatever. But I just, that to me, the real depressing thing is this idea of nobody should be allowed to say X or Y, and professors and universities afraid to either make, clear statements or, anyway, I just want people to come to all of my events and hear me speak. No, I really want people who think that they disagree with me to come here, come tell me why. And I guess the funniest thing about all of this, right, is that, I mean, I'm a journalist and not ever talking from this point of advocating a particular position at all. So it's sort of this, so much of this is made up. I'm protesting you, or I'm protesting this thing, and they don't even know, people who are protesting don't even really know what that thing is or how it relates to what they're protesting. And so I think, my fear as I prepare to send my own kids off to college is just that the sort of essential thing that the university is supposed to be about is fading. And which, I'll just say one more thing, and ready for the lightning round, I promise, about safe spaces and brave spaces. I can't remember who it is that, various people have said this, but it's been written really poignantly. I think this idea that, I'm really terrified by the concern over being uncomfortable in college, because college is, I think maybe Michael Roth at Wesleyan wrote this in the New York Times, you're supposed to be uncomfortable. I mean, the whole idea is that you leave your home and your place where things are known to you and everything's familiar and your parents are around, and you go to this place where you are surrounded by people who are different from you, and they come from different places, and they're studying different things, and they believe they have different values from you, and you're thrown in with them. You have to live with a roommate that you've never met before, and you're in a class where people are making you read something that challenges everything you thought you knew was true. And all of that discomfort, political, intellectual, personal discomfort, is the magic of college and the way that this growth happens. And we should want to be uncomfortable. We should want our kids to be uncomfortable. Let them come home and we can hug them and they can be comfortable, but they're in college, they should be uncomfortable. And they should be the biggest thing they should be exposed to is diversity of political thought. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So as we prepare for our lightning round, if somebody can bring up the note cards, then I will look those over as we're hearing our 60-second sound bites from our panelists. So as we sort of look to the future, as the semester rolls on, either descriptively or prescriptively, Eric, if you could start us off, 60 seconds on how you see the future unfolding.
I'm actually going to cede all 60
Microphone.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to cede all my 60 seconds to the previous comments of my colleague Jody. That's what I would have said, so I don't need to speak.
Thanks.
Rebecca, if you could take only 60 seconds, you don't get 120 because Eric cedes his, but 60 to talk about maybe what you've talked to me earlier about it with regard to donors. Is that something you wanted to cover, or do you want to go in a different direction? The great withholding.
Oh, so I mean, I think what's happening, and you spoke about it a little, the way that people have responded. So I think what's fascinating about this moment is how alumni see themselves as stakeholders and have really been galvanized. And I'm calling it the great withhold. That's what we've experienced. No one wants to give 1 penny to Columbia, including Jewish studies. So we used to have 3 postdocs. We have 0 for next year. And we want to bring someone from Israel. We can't do that, because if you have no money, you can't bring someone from Israel. So it has been a fascinating moment when we're like, you are shooting yourselves in the foot. We need to bring people to campus who can nuance and give a more complex view. I mean, Israelis have a lot to say about this moment, and not all of them are pro what is going on in Israel, and it is important for the campus to hear the many voices of Israel, but it has been impossible for us because I said how my job transformed on October 7th. We were the first unit of Columbia to put 2 lines up. We condemn the attacks of Hamas and we stand with the people of Israel. That's all we put across our website, right? And no other unit of Columbia did that for 3 weeks. So everyone was writing to us, why is no one else making comments? And we're like, well, we're the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies. We definitely have, a comment. But I think that this is going forward as a moment of thinking through what started with Bill Ackman and Rowan, of how defunding universities, there is a long history of Jews at Columbia. If we stop funding them, it is not going to help the situation on campus. So please don't be mad at Jewish Studies. We did not do this problem. Okay.
Dan, what do you think in terms of 60-second looking to the future, whether with regard to faculty, presidential leadership, you name it?
Well, I mean, Yes, I do think that one of the things that I would like to see would be a bolder kind of presidential leadership in universities. And I know all the different factors and forces that go into making often these people as timid and over-lawyered as possible. But I thought, there was an excellent piece actually written in the Washington Post last December after the whole debacle of Claudine Gay and Liz McGill testifying on Capitol Hill. And Danielle Allen, who teaches at Harvard, and I heard a rumor she may have been one of the finalists for the presidency that ended up, they ended up hiring Claudine Gay. But, for the first time, she was actually posing questions, like, not parsing what exactly we can say or not say, what is, and certainly, and not kind of any kind of like robotic, depends on context. She was actually addressing issues of like, what do we want to be? Like, what is our mission as a university? What do we feel is worth defending? What kind of culture do we want to create? And she very specifically distinguished between what she called a culture of intimidation, okay, in which some of what was going on with these riots and these, I shouldn't say riot, but protests and later encampments, okay, I mean, they were intimidating. Okay, I mean, these weren't just like people, these were not peace rallies, okay? You went there often with like the sound of intifada and the banging and the drums. It was not, peaceful. It was not anti-war. She distinguished between, she said, a culture of intimidation and a culture of respect. And ultimately, a culture of respect, I agree with everything that my colleagues are saying, okay? But it can't just be that Jewish students are expected to go to campus and demonstrate that. It has to be that everybody expects to go to campus and be challenged, and not to have certain ideas or terms or words kind of rendered beyond, treated as what cannot be, what cannot be mentioned. So that I would love to see. I would love to see Danielle Allen be named president of Harvard. Maybe, and hopefully she'll be, continue to be as bold and brave as she's been.
Thank you. Jody, you get the last word for the lightning round, if you want it.
The question again is, what do I think will happen in the future on campus?
do you have any predictions, or do you have any prescriptive comments about what you'd like to see?
I guess I'll say two things very quickly. I mean, one is I think the most depressing thing of the last year was the decline in presidential and other university leadership. I think we saw very little kind of thought leadership that I could respect from presidents and actually from faculties as well. And so I really hope that I rely on that as societally, and I just hope we get back to a place where we see real intellectual leadership from those offices. The second thing I'll just say, and I know there have been a handful of icky things already this fall, but it is a profoundly different feeling than it was in the spring. And it is very contained, and it is being contained very quickly. I think that's really the result of two things. I mean, one is many campuses adopted much stricter codes around protests coming back. But the second is, I really think that what happened last spring, I don't want to delegitimize the core of the protest movement that are deeply concerned about the way Israel has prosecuted the war in Gaza and the broader occupation. But the encampments and the broader movement had clearly become about much more than that. It had clearly become a proxy for many other grievances of the young left. And I think it really eventually kind of turned into like a collective scream. And I think a big part of what that scream was about actually was about Biden and Biden's refusal to step aside at the time, and what was perceived as his going back on his promise to not run for a second term, and like a real fear among the young left that Trump was going to be reelected because of it. And I think that one thing that changed over the summer was the sort of, air went out of that balloon. And so there remain, of course, people who are deeply concerned about Gaza. There remain people who are very focused Black Lives Matter activists and others who see in Palestine a connection to their movement. But I think that the extent to which the sort of young left feels the need to collectively scream against the institutions of power that they connect the university to is not the same today as it was 6 months ago.
Thank you. I'm going to try something experimental for our Q&A session here. There's a lot of really interesting questions. I thought it might be interesting to prompt you all to be in dialogue with one another by having me read 4 questions. We're not in Seder time yet, but it seems like this might be, sorry, I'm here every Tuesday
Who's the
night.
Russia?
So I thought, I think I'm going to read the 4 questions. Each of you can choose which one to answer. And then if one of you doesn't like the answer that one of you gives, you can engage with that and so on and so forth. The reason I'm wanting to do this is that we have a reception to get to. And there's some food and drink. And so let's go through these 4 questions. That way I'll at least give some of the people who wrote them down a chance to be heard. So for all 4 of you, or for whoever wants to go first, why do you think anti-Israel protests tend to be centered on elite campuses? Is there anything about these institutions that promotes anti-Zionism? Second of all, if free speech is paramount on campus, how can we explain the suspension of Professor Amy Wax last week at UPenn? Her comments were on race and LGBTQ. Would she have been suspended for anti-Jewish comments? Third question, what do you think about the possibility of universities encouraging the adoption of specific definitions of anti-Semitism, whether IRA or any of the others? And then this one I thought was actually perhaps the most interesting, maybe the most poignant, and definitely reflects, I forget who said about the investment of alums in their alma maters. How do today's students want us to help them? Which begs the question, should they be helped by people who are alums or their parents, or should we just let them fend for themselves? So again, the 4 questions are about Amy Wax, about elite colleges being hotbeds of protest, the official IRA definition of anti-Semitism or any other, or how do today's students want us to help them? Rebecca, will you start us off on any of those? Or take 2, or 60 seconds, 70 seconds.
I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I'm going to just say that what's really important is the protest is not 68. There is no Kent State Gaza encampment, all right? So it's important it is taking place in universities with large Jewish populations, in cities where there are large Jewish populations. So I think this is something we need to be thinking through, what that means, why is happening. And I'm just going to respond to that last question of what should we be doing to help the students. I think that's a fascinating question because I think it is this presumption, right, that alumni have to be helping students now on campus, which is different. This is what I'm going to say. In 68, the alum didn't come to campus to change, to get the people out of low library. It was seen as that that's what the administrators had to do on campus. So we are in a new moment. All right, we are in a new moment, and what is the long-term legacy of that? I don't know. I'm better at the past than the future, but I think that these are really interesting things that I look forward to hearing.
Well, I'll jump on a couple, one that you did and one that you didn't. First of all, I absolutely do not want colleges to adopt any definition of anti-Semitism. I don't want them to adopt definitions of any particular term, particularly one that is, we have dictionaries, we have legal definitions of terms already established by courts, and universities should be places where they teach all the different debates of terms and talk about who supports which ones and why, and what their antecedents are, and they don't need to have official definitions of anything. Except they should have a definition of discourse and education, and it should be about engagement and open-mindedness. I think, and on the helping students thing, I'm gonna just say back off. First of all, there's this, I would say the way we can help, there's probably, how many college students are there in America? There's that many different ways they might need help from their parents, their teachers, their administrators, their friends, and from the communities they belong to. And I don't think there's one way, and I don't know that, I think they're in college, let them go and be and do their thing.
Dan?
Well, I actually agree with Jody entirely. I think the effort to kind of legislate a definition on anti-Semitism on campus is ill-advised. I actually find, the whole, on both sides, the kind of obsession with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition, or IRA. On the one hand, those who feel so deeply invested in it that they are adamant that it be given kind of legal force behind it. But I'll say also the people on the left who object to it so strongly are constantly imputing to that definition things that it never says because it's useful to them. With respect to the Amy Wax thing, she says deplorable things, but I have noticed the fact that my Twitter, or whatever it's called, has been, there's the sound of, left-wing professors on Twitter about, expressing any kind of outrage about the fact that she is being penalized for things that she is saying. Well, I haven't seen it. Okay, so that again raises the question, like, is this a consistent defense of academic freedom, or is it a selective one? But the final thing I would just say is, I worry a lot. The university I went to when I started graduate school 25 years ago and studying Jewish studies is very different from what it is now. The humanities, in most places are taking it on the chin, and when professors either leave to take other positions or retire or die, often they're just not being replaced. Jewish studies certainly is in some places it's still going strong, but in many places it's much weaker than it was. And part of that I do feel is, a kind of short-sightedness on the part of the university. For not, valuing, what the humanities can be. But I can't help but feel that some of the responsibility lies on the humanities themselves for how much they've leaned into. Some of the most kind of radical voices who how I put it, it's like in some ways, it's like, if I can reverse things, I feel like this time it's like the tenured radicals who are digging their own graves, not the bourgeoisie. Because, if this is what you present, all you can do is, it's kind of just deconstructing of narratives and always focusing on how we talk about things and not about things themselves. And then in many ways how they showcased themselves last year, you're going to make yourself seem less and less relevant if you don't balance some degree of criticism of a tradition with also a certain degree of reverence for it as well.
Eric, if you can, thank you, Dan. Eric, if you can bring us to the finish line in whatever way you deem appropriate.
This guy's really got the crowd with him tonight.
You think I'm a demagogue?
Talk about it later. Couple things. On Amy Wax, today, a professor at the University of Wisconsin was fired, a tenured professor was fired, because he had a hobby of making porn videos with his wife. And he made these videos and he defended them and he was not ashamed. He said this is his hobby. He wanted, and he did it kind of as a test of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, because it didn't affect his teaching that he was making porn videos, but it embarrassed the administration. My daughter is an alumnus of that school. And I raise this. I don't think he should have been fired. But I raise this because what is the job of a university president, really? It's to raise money. And how do you raise money? Well, you keep your U.S. News and World Report number really high, even though nobody respects the criteria by which they define them. Nobody does, but they can't help it. You also maybe have a good football team. Again, irrelevant. And you keep your donors happy, right? And the way you make your donors unhappy, Columbia donors are very unhappy now. The faculty is a pain in the ass, but they can't do very much because they have tenure, and tenure is very hard to get now. It's always been hard to get, but it's wonderful. I have it. I love it. But nobody wants to give it up, and so the faculty, they just sign collective letters, and Maybe a few of them join the camp, but they can't really do anything. So your job is really just to keep your donors happy and to preserve your reputation with the public, with the part of the public that's paying attention to whether or not you're keeping your donors happy. Now, this problem of freedom of speech on this issue and encampments, it's a Jewish problem. Rebecca pointed this out. It's happening in big cities where there's lots of Jews. It's not only elite institutions, because it happened at CUNY also, and Rutgers, where there's also lots of Jews, but these are urban areas. It's not happening anywhere else. If you look at people who are deeply involved in this issue, say that the Democrats are going to lose the election because Biden and therefore now Harris is too sympathetic to Israel and young people really care about Gaza. Well, if you do a survey, if you look at the surveys of what do young people care about, they do like the Palestinians better than they like Israel. The issue is somewhere between issue number 11 and number 15 as the most important issue for young people in the United States. It's not a thing. It's not a thing for most students, even at the elite universities, and it's not a thing at all. You know that 77% of college students in the United States go to public colleges. 80% of those go to college within 25 miles of where they were born. They're going to college. They're not going to protest university. They're going to college, and those are the people who college is for. I got nothing against protests. I went to some protests in my life. I think they're fun. I think they can serve a purpose, but what we need to be talking about, I think, is that wonderful last question of how we can serve our students. And I think we all agree we can't serve them by protecting them from ideas that they might find uncomfortable. We can serve them by teaching them the critical faculties that allow them to engage with those ideas, to be intellectuals, to say, on the one hand, I have my own emotional investment in certain beliefs, but I may be wrong. I may be wrong. That's why I'm here, because I may be wrong. So that's...
And also to be curious about what the person down the hall believes and where they came from.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. And the reception is open to everybody, so please go out into the Great Hall and we'll see you there. Thanks everyone for coming again this evening.